to use Peggy Reagan's term, can be offensive by putting up a price, making a commodity out of certain things, may be offensive. So is what I've called commandification, making it too clear what is which. So what do we do? But that is also true. That is also true if the problem is that I am offended not by there being a price, but by the fact that this good is allocated according to the prevailing wealth distribution. And I think you find that most merit goods fall into that category. I probably wouldn't mind having a purely voluntary military draft if you charged the Koch brothers or Bill Gates huge amounts to stay out of the army so that as many rich would go in as poor. I might not mind even the pricing of body parts if the rich had to pay much more to get them than the poor. The poor were subsidized. Think of health. Think of education. Or in fact do that to some extent. And the same, by the way, is true of command, because command, power, is also not equally distributed. So we are offended by doing this by command because we know perfectly well who the people in power are and who will be the ones who get it, because the distribution of power is as unequal as the distribution of wealth. Now there are some people who would say, if you put it that way, then the answer is to make a more equal wealth distribution or more equal distribution of power. But the difficulty with that is if you really made a distribution of wealth and power which was sufficiently great so that we would not, people like me, be offended by that, we would have so equal a distribution that we wouldn't have incentives. And it would be inefficient. It is more efficient, in a way, to say, yes, we will allow a degree of distributional differences, but take some goods out and have them be priced differently. You know, during the last war, the big war, we did that with rationing. We had some things which were priced according to ration coupons, and everybody had the same amount and could trade off broccoli against bananas against zucchini and so on. Or not everybody had the same amount. Some had a right to have more, but not as much as in the wealth distribution. Okay. All that says that if we got into it, we would find that there are possible solutions. Why don't economists talk about that at all? The reason is that they ignore, systematically ignore, third-party values. They say, look, if you want to sell your thing to him, that's Pareto superior. You're happier, you're happier. Pareto superior, hooray, hooray, everybody better off, nobody worse off. Baloney, I'm worse off. Because I'm offended. And why aren't my values every bit as good as the values of the two who are negotiating? I don't like it if you sell yourself into slavery. I'm sorry, I don't like it. To the extent that economists ignore these third-party values, and they do it systematically, they have nothing to say about what is one of the most significant issues. How do we deal with merit goods and not? And just as I'm not going to tell you today about how we deal with altruism, I'm not going to tell you today how, if we went into it, if we made the model sophisticated enough, we should deal with these merit goods, which, by the way, include even campaign contributions, you know, me just say about that. I believe, with the Supreme Court of the United States, that people have a right to speak through money, and not just through work or talk. But where I think the Supreme Court is totally wrong is to act as if, because people have a right to speak through money, Mr. Koch or Mr. Gates or Mr. whatever, who is so rich, and who doesn't care a damn, really, and throws $20 billion into it because he's got so much that it doesn't matter, completely out talks poor Pepe, who cares passionately about the thing that doesn't have so much money. That is, I'd be perfectly happy to let people can put in as much money as they wanted if it weren't based on the prevailing wealth distribution. If when Mr. Gates gave some money, or Mr. Koch gave some money, he was taxed for every $1 million, $25 million. And that was used to increase the pittance that Pepe gives to make it as powerful. In other words, if that were taken out of the prevailing wealth distribution. By the way, for those of you who occasionally like biblical things, it's all there. In the gospel, Jesus walks into the synagogue and sees rich people putting gold coins in, and a widow putting in a copper coin. And he says, she has given much more than they, because she has given from her need, they have given from their excess. What the First Amendment, what speech is important in campaign contribution, is the extent of desire. And Pepe's desire is much more when he gives his pittance than Cox or the other. In other words, having a different approach. Okay, again, there's a lot to be said technically about it, but what is interesting is that economists have systematically ignored the value of third-party utility. And they have done it again because it makes for a much more complicated model to bring it in. Now, does that mean that you have to bring it into all models? Of course not. There are all sorts of things which can be explained perfectly well and dealt with a more simple model. There are things as to which there's no need to take into account that markets are costly. There are things where we can talk only about pure markets and pure command. There are things which we can deal with perfectly well, ignoring third-party effects. And when we do that, economists should be free to ignore these things which make the model more complicated. But there are issues, and they are crucially important issues, which when you look at the real world are there, which cannot be done without making the model more complicated, without taking into account values that are systematically being ignored by economists. And if it is too complicated for the economist's model to deal with them, then the economist had better say, there are these and we can't deal with them. They have to be dealt with by some other social science. They have to be dealt with in some other way, but we don't really have anything to say about it. Not say it's Pareto superior, so it's okay. They have to admit that they cannot introduce these values into the model, or they're lying about the Gustavus non disputandum est. And that's what they do. Okay. So, I think I have much more faith in economists, actually, and think that when they are pushed, they could do a very good job on many of these things. And what we would learn would be interesting, not only with resolving the specific issue, but others. Any number of things can be dealt with well if you start taking into account hemi, semi, demi prices and hemi, semi, demi command. It's harder to do. Let me give you the silliest before I turn to what I think economists can actually do about values and things which helps. The silliest case, and I've written about this one, the others I'm writing on now, where economists ignore costs, which is the same thing as values. To economists, there's a tremendous difference between moving to the Pareto frontier, to efficiency, and moving the Pareto frontier out. This is inefficient, let's move to the Pareto frontier. Or, instead, something moves the frontier out. I wrote an article called The Pointlessness of Pareto, or Carrying Coase Further, in which I said, we are always at the Pareto frontier. We are always at the Pareto frontier. That sounds startling. But think about it a moment. If there actually were a point where everybody would be better off and no one would be worse off, why wouldn't we go there? Why on earth wouldn't we go there if there were a point where everybody were better off and no one was worse off? Of course we'd go there. Why don't we go there? Because we don't know it's fair. Lack of knowledge is also what keeps us from moving the frontier out. If we had a better way of diminishing friction, it would cost less to drive. Or there are costs of moving from here to there. But they're real costs too. Who's going to bear them? The reason why we don't move to a place which might be is because it's too costly. There are transaction costs to going there. So where we are is always, in a sense, Pareto optimum. Now, what is the difference between the costs of moving the frontier outward and the costs of going to what economists say is to the frontier? Is there any difference between those types of costs? Well, yes, in a funny way, that the costs of moving to the frontier, moving to what economists call the frontier, are costs which we pay economists to diminish. They're costs which we pay economists to tell us, actually, if you went there, it would be cheaper, and to convince us and to lessen the cost. The costs of moving the frontier out are costs which we pay other disciplines, physicists, chemists, and so on. They're all the same thing, knowledge costs, transaction costs, but they're costs addressed to different disciplines. So it is perfectly understandable that economists, when they are talk about moving to the frontier as something which they are being paid to do, and do something and show you why you should do it. And if we are not comparing how much money we should spend on economists as against physicists, it's perfectly fine for them to ignore that, because they're telling us something useful. Just as it's perfectly fine to ignore some values if that isn't the issue we're discussing. But if we are discussing the question of whether it is worthwhile spending money on physicists to move the frontier outward or economists to move up to the frontier, then we better take into account the costs of moving to the frontier. Which is just another example of saying you don't have to make the model more complicated in every instance. But if the issue you are facing is one which requires you to take into account certain values and costs which economists today ignore, then economists had better take them into account or admit that they can't deal with them. And that's the first part of my talk. Second part is more radical and short. And that is, what can economists tell us about tastes and values? Well, if you knew nothing about tastes, and all tastes and values were the same, then I don't think anybody can tell us anything. Ex nihilo nihilo. Out of nothing, nothing. But if you will allow me just two basic values, and very simple one that economists take for granted all the time, that more is better than less. Okay? That a bigger pie is more desirable than a smaller pie. Okay? That's a very simple one. Economists make it all the time. And second, a distributional preference. Some preference for how a pie should be distributed. And I don't care what preference you take. For the moment, for my analysis today, I'm going to say, suppose you admit with me that we prefer a bigger pie and other things being equal, a more equally divided pie. As I said, the second one doesn't have to be that way, but that's right. Can we then say something about subsidiary values to that? And the answer is yes. That if you admit me these two values, then it is the case that laws and things that encourage people to like things, to want things, to value things that are not scarce, that are in large supply, as against wanting things which are scarce, we get a larger joint maximization of the two basic values. We can have a larger pie with a more equal distribution. That is, if people like plain water, good water, rather than great wine, ordinary sex, rather than sex as some strange people in Hollywood seem to act as if they do. Things that are commonly in supply, you can get a larger pie, which are more equally divided. And therefore, any laws, rules, and things subsidiary that encourage people to like things that are in wide supply increase your two basic values. And joint maximization, by the way, is something that economists are very good at doing. Well, you can say that doesn't tell you very much. But let me add a third value. Desire to be creative, to create. Not quite as easy as these first two values, and yet I think there is almost no religion, and I don't care whether it's true or whether it's metaphor, that doesn't speak of us as being in the likeness of the Creator. The desire to create is something that is very deep in people and in most society. So if we say, let us say that we want a larger pie, a more equal pie, and the capacity to be creative as three values, super values. What does that immediately tell us? That to the extent that people, by laws, rules, because they affect values, are encouraged to want, to value things which allow creativity to be done by lots of people, not just scarce. Because if it's scarce, then you have to give incentives. And if you have to give incentives, either good incentives, which make you richer and equal, or bad incentives that hit you, which make you poorer and unequal. So you get the better joint maximization if you have something which furthers these values, which is not scarce. Now what does that say? That starts to tell you some things about specifics. There are advantages to mass production. But handicraft and art of a local sort that lets wide number of people be creative allows creativity with less scarcity. So do we value that enough? Or good cooking. Do you have to go to a 3-star restaurant? Or is it something that we tell people we value good home cooking? Or singing in the shower as against going to the opera? No. There are any number of ways of having creativity be something that is available to everybody if we value the right things, as against only to people like me who have a magnificent tenor voice, or I'm a great cook, or I'm a Hollywood sex star, or whatever. And if you think about it, people in America, this I like to say to people in America, because people in America say, why is it that people in Italy and France seem so much happier than we are? And if you think about it, some of the things they seem happier about is because they value good home cooking or good local things. Well, we tend not to. But there's something even more important in this. What is one activity that is immensely creative, also has drudgery in it, but it is immensely creative and is available to almost everyone? Bringing up children. Bringing up children is an immensely creative activity. Think about it now. If because of our good values, we downplay bringing up children because we want women to be equal with men, and one easy way of making women equal with men is making women go and do the things men do, become like men, and have the bringing up children be done by specialists over here. Send them off somewhere. That may be okay, it may accomplish something, but it removes from a very large number of people a highly creative activity that is not scarce. If instead we approach the problem by laws and things which further the value of bringing up children as something everybody, men and women, should do, so that we don't lose the equality, but change the tastes, so that this becomes an activity that is available to everybody, involves changing values, which involves changing laws to do it. You have now created something which is a highly creative activity that is available in a non-scarce way, and therefore you can get a larger joint maximization of these three values. Now, again, I'm not really today talking about laws about children, about food, about sex, or about any of these. What I'm saying is that here is something about values that economists are especially good at analyzing. Were they willing to do it? They could perfectly well, you could, as economists, lawyers, whatevers, perfectly well could go and look at a society and say, what are the core values of that society empirically? Larger pie, more equal pie, creativity, bananas, 4 or 5. It's complicated, that's why you need economists, and say, then what are the subsidiary laws that will further those values, which will give you the greatest joint maximization of these? And all of a sudden, economists, instead of being out of the value business, become people who can be extremely helpful to a society in figuring out what to do and what laws are better in this sense and what laws are worse. In other words, we can give some answers to the question that the critics asked that had nothing to say about it. That had nothing to say about it. Then the question is, do these laws actually further those values, or do you get counter effects? Those are all things that lawyers have to worry about. But first they need to know what it is we're trying to do. I suggest that you could do even more. Maybe economists have to be more daring, but that this step is one that doesn't require economists to do anything which they do not do already in any number of ways. An empirical study of what the values of that society are, and then taking your values, doing my model, and saying what is and what does not give you higher maximization. The more dramatic thing would be for an economist to say, well, I'm not really limited to what are the values, the 4 or 5 values of that society. I'm going to say these 5 or 6 values are values that I think the society ought to have, and be open about it, and then say, on the basis of these, if you agree with me about them, then we do joint maximization and the second. And that, I would hope economists would also be willing to do. That requires them to do something more, but to the extent that they want to be effective in the world, I think they probably should do that as well. But even if they don't do that, what I've said before would be a dramatic, mind-boggling opening up for the world of law and economics and what can be done in the future. I'm 81 years old. I don't know how much time I've got left. I do know that it is extremely unlikely that I will have time to do many of these detailed next steps. That is, I doubt that I will be able to give a full analysis of altruism once you take into account hemi, semi, demi prices, or the effect of taking it into account. I doubt that I can do more than say, look at what happens if you take third-party utilities into effect about merit goods. But if you do all sorts of things, I doubt if I can actually sit down and do the empirical work to say, in Indonesia, these are the basic values, and this is what follows. Or even say, let's assume these, and that follows. I don't think I have time. Probably that isn't how I best spend my time. What I can do, though, is point out that that is where the future lies. Not in economic analysis of law and taking the existing model, oh yeah, that's useful, and looking at it and saying it doesn't fit, throw it out. But in doing these things, that's what you can do, because you're young. That's where the future lies. And if you do it, you'll not only have a tremendous amount of fun, but you'll also do something that is very useful. And believe me, the secret to a good life is 2 things. One is find something to do with your life which is fun and useful. I claim I've never done a day's work in my life. Not true. But I've had a heck of a good time doing things which are useful. And the second, which is just as important, is find somebody to spend your life with. Anne and I have been married more than 50 years. It takes time to find that. The 2 things are both important. Today we're talking about the first. Second is important too. But if I can give you some things to do, which might be fun and useful, my trip has been useful. Thank you. Longer today. Time for a few questions, and I got to go pack and get out of here. But if there are questions, happy to answer. I've given you some very heavy stuff to think about.
First of all, I think that people are not just affected by values. Also, values are affected by theories, economical theories.
Terrorism.
Theories, economical theories.
Theories. Yes.
Sorry about that.
I don't pronounce PHs either.
Yeah, I don't have that in my language. So, when we integrate altruism in an economical model, we put a price on altruism because economics works in the mechanism of prices. And if we do that, even if we don't like it or not, there is some kind of certain distribution in the society. And when we price something, this kind of distribution will make rich benefit from these theories, and that will change people's thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I am a lawyer, and so I talk about laws as affecting values and laws being affected by it. But I think you're quite right. It was the same thing about theories. And what is that saying? In a way, it is saying that if you move from a model which is theory to the world and then back to the model, you change the model because of the world and because of that. So that you are just, in fact, applying what I could be saying to a parallel situation. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
He has two questions.
I would like to ask you how you disentangle between altruism and self-interest altruism. What I mean.
Altruism, that is something that gives me pleasure because.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
is actually what you can put in a utility fund.
That's right. Now, the two things are, of course, different, and economists have a good deal to say about altruism, which is just me feeling good, getting pleasure, getting something by doing something. The gift, as Cosimo Mazzoni is writing a book about, saying not as a gift, but actually as a tragedy, as something that I impose on you. I think that both are there. I think it is that economists, because they can handle the first, because that fits in the model of pure command and pure pricing, can handle the problem of self-interested altruism and have brought it into their thinking. Because they cannot handle the other, they act as though the other is not there. But I think it's unrealistic to think that the other isn't there. And if you think about it, it's kind of interesting. I don't only want other people to be altruistic. That is, I get pleasure, not if I give, but I get pleasure from seeing other people give. I see you being nice to her, and I say, gee, that's nice. I see you being mean to him, and I don't like that. And that's there. But when you think about it that way, you start to see that altruism in this sense is not just one good, but a series of different goods. I get pleasure from a government that is altruistic, and displeasure from a government that is not. I get pleasure from not-for-profit organizations, as I also get pleasure from individual altruism. So then the question is, what mixture of these is most effective in bringing about the result and yet most effective in giving me pleasure. We could do everything by a sweet state, which was just as nice and loving as could be, and yet hate that if individuals were mean, mean, mean. Even though the result in terms of getting goods up would be the same, or the reverse of a situation in which everybody was very nice, but the state was as mean as the one that Newt Gingrich wanted to have. In fact, altruism turns out to be, even unself-interested altruism, turns out to be not just one good, but goods that are related and substitutes. Porcini mushrooms, truffles, and caviar. You know, I like them all, and I got more of one or of the other, so on. And if you start thinking that way, then the whole matter becomes both more complicated but more realistic. And then you can distinguish that altruism which is also there, which is self-interest. More trouble for you rather than that.
I do have two questions.
Two questions.
The first is, if I understood what you were saying at the beginning of your lecture, is that there is kind of a bilateral relationship between law and values. And in a sense, there's like a bottom-up and up-to-down relationship. So both affect, the two domains affect each other. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you kind of arrange criminal law in this situation in a term that we've always been kind of told that in a liberal system, criminal law should never be a kind of like up-to-bottom process because it would be illiberal, and it cannot put values in a society, but it is always to be a bottom-up kind of relationship.
Well, you know, I don't like much of American criminal law for any number of reasons. On the other hand, I think it's kind of odd not to have values in the criminal law system. I mean, you know, one of the reasons we think that some things are bad is because we don't like them. And so I think that it is that people do that because it becomes like a nice argument, but I think it probably ultimately undercuts getting to a truly liberal position of saying, you know, would we be happier if we could get to certain results of not having certain crimes without treating people in certain ways? What's your second?
It's about...
He's learned to make them separate. You see, you can affect values.
I was thinking about your lecture yesterday, about your model of the liability rule. Do you think that values may affect judges' decision on allocation of costs in accident? In the sense that it's not only economics, in the sense like, oh, that person has to bear that cost just because I like it, because it's fair.
Well, I think that it is probably not desirable for judges to, most of the time, to say, I want it to come out this way in this case because I like this person and don't like that person. I think that probably is not good for judges to do. On the other hand, it is certainly the case, and has always been the case, that judges are permitted and have chosen between somebody as a representative of a category that I think as a judge should be favored. So we can say this rule helps the poor, and that's a perfectly acceptable reason for a judge to say, I favor this rule. There have certainly been hundreds of rules in the past that have been done, this rule helps the rich or the elite. Those of you who know English law, Rylance v. Fletcher, in which the court refused to require fault for liability when the person who was damaged was an old line landowner, at the same time that they were requiring fault for liability when the person who was damaged was an ordinary person in the street was an example of the courts deciding that the old elites should be favored. Today, that case, because the language of that case was one about natural uses and unnatural uses, which at the time meant favored the elite. That case has become popular because it favors ecologically desirable users over ecologically not. But it's the same thing. Now, the question of whether one is right or wrong is a different one. But of course judges do that. All the time. And the people who say they don't are again simply ignoring what is the real world.
I can talk loud. I'm thinking about from a macro perspective, especially on the human rights discourse. So, for example, the fact of enforcing human rights in developing countries, and sometimes the fact that these developing countries use the human rights discourse as a form of way to access market transactions with developed countries. Could it be considered a form of self-interest altruism?
Yes, and by the way, I have no objection to that at all. That is, to the extent that you can do it. This is what I mean by semi-demi prices. To the extent that you can encourage people in market or semi-market ways to do things that you think are desirable, that's perfectly fine. I mean, let me just take a step back. When I started, before most people did anything in law and economics, and when I started, people didn't do that. Way back in 1955, before your parents were born, when I was a student in first term course, and I started seeing these things, I started doing it, and somebody asked me, why are you doing this? And I said, there was a great 19th century hymn writer named Wesley, founder of the Methodists, who wrote beautiful hymns, and people said, why are you writing hymns? And he said, because I don't believe the devil should be the only one who has good music. And that was my answer. I don't think economics and economic incentives should be the property of right-wingers. I was not, and I thought you can use many of these things to achieve goals which are goals of more liberal. Why should we be stuck only with some means which sometimes work, command, when others may work better? Like using this form of self-interested altruism, of saying, if you do this, we will give you this, in a way that doesn't destroy the altruism, but doesn't. Of course. And that's one very good reason for doing what we do. Absolutely. And it is the reason that had motivated me at first, and in other ways still does.
So, going back to the idea that economists can support the values of the society and come up with the mechanisms for supporting the policies of society, I'm wondering about what you think